was thinking about, Genesis 1 almost as this kind of great big photograph, because there's this kind of grand exposure which kind of brings into being the cosmos.
And that's the life of the philosopher, and so on and so forth. So that this photogogia in Iamblichus, I like to translate it as "let the light lead you."
So the theurgist needs to empty his soul in order to receive, to become a container for divine light.
Oh, dear Diana, tell me why do the things that are beautiful always have a darker side? Oh, dear Diana, tell me why is the good never good enough? Underneath the dirt and scar is an old and familiar face.
Hi, welcome back to The Ladder, Journeys in Platonic Mysticism. Today I am joined by my colleague and dear friend, Theresa Mikuriya, author of The History of Light, The Idea of Photography, pretty much one of the most polymathic minds I know, expert in all sorts of things, whether it be the history of light, but photography in itself, contemporary philosophy, Derrida. She's done everything from making photo albums, album covers for records, so on and so forth. But really, just one of those people who lights up the spirit of philosophy and its way of life, and how it is that we all have a certain kind of perspective that we should focus on with regards to images and creation and beauty. So thank you very much for being here, Theresa. I'm very proud to have you here as a friend and a conversational companion. And I wanted to start off with what seems like a deceptively simple question, but the way I described you, I know that you're all over the place and your mind is moving, and so I can't help but see the Platonist in you in every interaction I have. And so I want to ask, do you consider yourself a Platonist? And if so, why or why not? And where do you take that to mean, and how does it entangle itself in your way of life?
Well, first of all, thank you, Danny, for your very generous introduction. Definitely not worthy of such a kind and lovely introduction of me. And thank you, Gareth and Danny, both for inviting me to your podcast. This is for me, I love the podcast. I've been listening to some of your episodes, and I think it's brilliant and very, very important work that you're doing, both of you. That's a tough question for me. I would say whether or not I am a Platonist. I would say a certain type of Platonist, maybe the more mystic Plato, the mystic Socrates that I'm very much drawn to. I was really drawn to Plato really through writing about light and thinking about the image and the notion of the sun, and of course the Neoplatonists such as Iamblichus and his theurgic practice, which I find very close to some of my own Buddhist practice. So I think this notion of cultivating wisdom and how it's linked to also our spirit and our soul, that's something that I'm still trying to learn more about Plato in this sense.
No, I mean, one of the arguments I love from your book is basically something very close to one of Gareth's favorite philosophers, Roland Barthes, and saving the appearances, right? Like that part of what your work does from beginning pages of the history of light is to show this very strange analogy, right? Or in fact, this very, and I say strange almost on purpose, atopos, right? Out of place characteristic of this history of understanding something like the allegory of the cave as also being something revolutionary or revealing about photography itself, right? That the photography and the act of creating photographs has a kind of link to Plato's image of the darkness of the cave and then coming out of the cave and then returning to the cave. Could you let your readers know the argument that you have for that connection between photography and Plato's allegory of the cave?
Yeah, sure. My book is really an attempt to trace the presence of the photographic in the history of Western thought before the technological invention of photography. And with Plato's allegory of the cave, most writings about the allegory focus on the illusory nature of the images and how the prisoners are always just stuck with their faces, their heads towards the shadows, which they think are so-called reality. But for me, what was very interesting was this kind of the movement, just like what you mentioned, Danny, of darkness to light and light back to darkness, which I find resonates a lot with photographic technology of photographic practice, indeed. The notion of with the cave, and of course, I mean, the most obvious thing would be, I think Francis Ford Cornford, he's written beautifully about the cave as a kind of proto-cinema kind of device as such. For me, you can think about the cave also as a photographic camera. And then, of course, what interests me is the burst of light that inundates the cave and how the prisoner, when he is released into the world outside of the cave, then he gets to look at the reflections in the water, and then slowly he lifts his eyes up to see the constellation and the night sky before he's finally able to see the sun as it is in its own place. And that's what Socrates says to Glaucon. And it's a very strange image for me, because how can you look at the sun? If you stare at the sun, you go blind. And for me, this notion of the abundance of light is something very close to photography, because every act of fixing with light is always threatened with a possibility of the superabundance of light, which means it's an immediate erasure of the photographic image. And this notion of overexposure is also, you find resonances with certain spiritual practices or even in theurgic practice, when the self is so inundated with divine light that the boundaries between the self and the divine all melt away.
No, yeah, you use the example of the Shroud of Turin, if I remember correctly, right? Where it's not necessarily the photograph isn't necessarily just the chemicals and the paper and the technological equipment that we have today, but the photograph has been, in the words of Socrates, as you would argue, by creating these images for Glaucon, so that they're impressed upon his soul, so as to live in a certain way, i.e. the philosophical way, because when you live the philosophical way, you become that receptacle for divine light, so that things can be impressed on people in much the same way that a photograph is a kind of impression, if you will, that's receptive to the light. It needs both the dark and the light to be made, right? So too much light, overexposed, as you just said, too little, you're not going to get, if you don't have the denseness or the smoothness or the texture, as you argue, then you're not going to get any images, you're just going to get darkness. But anyways, I digress. The reason why I mentioned the Cloud of Turin is because that's one of the examples you give of not the Cloud of Turin, Shroud of Turin. I wonder what the Cloud of Turin is. In any case, as there are these people who are around the Christ, and because they have such divine light, we get that impression in the shadow or the figure of Christ, so that we've been making photographs, right, writing with light, for a long time. This is why, it's not unusual to be seeing these parallels between contemporary technology that takes what we call photographs and image making with divine light that I think haunts a lot of the texts that we read, a lot of the paintings that we study. You even mentioned the painting with beeswax. I forget what that's called. this kind of to make masks in Egypt and things like this for people to remember. Again, that the photograph is also about remembering and reminding us of the light that is there. That is the space of being. I'm sorry, I'm getting too in depth with your book because I just love it so much. But here, you recently gave a paper on Khoratic unconcealment, and the second chapter of your book is on Plato's Timaeus and the third kind. What role does Khora have for you in this history of light and photography?
Well, for me, I've always been very fascinated by Khora. I think that there are certain, I would say that there is something photographic about Khora, and that Khora shares with photography certain tropes. In the paper you mentioned, the paper Khoratic Concealment, I was very much interested in just one aspect of Khora, which is this notion of withdrawal in order to give place, or the generosity of Khora, one can say. And one of the tropes that I think Khora shares with photography is, and it appears, the word imagery appears in 50C, isn't it, in the Timaeus, and it refers to, I think it's translated in different ways, like the matrix in which things are impressed on it, or the natural recipient of all things. But this word igmagion in the Little Scott Dictionary, it is defined as napkin, that which wipes off, as well as that which is imprinted upon. So I'm very fascinated by this dual action of both inscription and erasure, which, as you've mentioned, the Turin Shroud, the other, it would be the veil of Veronica, or the Mandilion of Edessa. Mandilion of Edessa, I think that's the correct pronunciation of it. These images that are often considered to be proto-photographic, the acero poeti, images made without the intervention of the human hand. And with Veronica's veil, of course, the story is that Veronica, she wiped the sweat and blood off Jesus's face on the way to Calvary, and then Jesus's face was immediately imprinted onto the fabric. So I guess this can be considered to be a kind of like sacred selfie in many ways. So this notion of contact with the divine and fixed in this light of the divine is something that I'm very interested in. So of course we can see this notion of withdrawal and the imprint and erasure also in photography. As I mentioned earlier, that every act of fixing with light is always threatened by the immediate erasure through a superabundance of light. So this is how I try to bring Khora together with photography in my book. The other part of it would be this notion of the invisibility of Khora, so the formlessness of Khora. And often when you read about photography, a lot of photographic theorists would say that photography has no essence of its own. There are different ways of thinking about photography, the photographic medium, but I didn't know, Gareth, is Barth your favorite philosopher? I think Danny said that in the beginning.
Who's that? I'm sorry?
Is Roland Barthes, is he one of your favorites?
Well, I know. Well, I'm familiar with his ideas. I wouldn't say he's one of my favourites, I'm afraid, but no. I mean, certainly,
I
Canberra
meant to say
Lucid.
Barfield. Oh, that's what I did wrong. So
Yeah.
no, Barfield.
Canberra Lucida, obviously, and yeah, his influence on, because there's an interesting idea in Barthes in there about the distinction he makes and between the studium and the punctum, this idea of the thing which the photograph aims to address or on which it trains its attention, and then the thing which in a sense, it actually reveals, so to speak. And this is a very interesting idea, isn't it? Because I think one of the fascinating things that's bound up with photography, which I suppose you could compare in Platonic terms to maybe something like, Parmenides, is the sort of interrelationship between being and not being, or between being and nothing, or presence and absence, you could say. Interestingly, what you was talking about, because you were talking about the the archeropoieton, and then the sort of the trace of the image, and then you were talking about other things. It was I sort of started going on a digression in my own mind, and I was thinking about Genesis 1 almost as this kind of great big photograph, because there's the the let there be light and the separation of the light from the darkness. So it's this kind of grand exposure which kind of brings into being the cosmos. But also, as you say, I think that intrinsic sort of problem of photography, which is what it does and doesn't show, it sort of conceals and reveals, doesn't it? It's this sort of medium that's always very ambiguous in a way, and especially so, as you point out, in relation to the Republic, that to look at the sun is to be blinded, to be obscured in your vision. But of course, this is the teachings of the mystics, isn't it? In a sense, I mean, not only Platonic but Christian. I mean, someone like Gregory of Nyssa says, the more that one comes to contemplation, the more that one sees that the divine nature is invisible. The true understanding is that seeing consists in not seeing. So, I think this sense of what I was interested in asking you, because so that I won't digress too greatly on some of these points, but to sort of loop it back to some very interesting things you mentioned earlier, the sort of history of the depiction of the Platonic cave in the 20th century through the film and photographic avant-garde has taken on, or in my mind tended to take on, a more materialist determination, which is to say, in the kind of post-structuralist, Lacanian, Freudian, Marxian type film theorists, predominantly coming out of France, like Jean-Louis Baudry and Louis Althusser and these kinds of people, there was a distinctly sort of Marxian materialist sort of interpretation of the cave, really as, the false consciousness of the proletariat type idea, that you find in Lukács and these kinds of Marxist thinkers. And, effectively, to the extent that, people are duped and, they don't see the truth of reality, and so on and so forth. So it took on this very kind of Marxist materialist determination. And Baudry, in fact, wrote this essay on the cinema as being like prisoners in the cave and this kind of stuff. But in a funny way, that's one interpretation. But I think, if you look at the sort of mystical or spiritual or contemplative strand of a lot of other cinema and photography in the 20th century, you can see them teasing out the more subtle, transcendent and spiritual dimension of the cave allegory. And the difference, I suppose, and this is where it leads to the question I was going to ask you, the difference is between thinking of light merely as a material thing, or thinking of light as both something material and metaphysical, let's say, as something that is beyond its materiality, which is where, of course, it takes on its character in so much of the Platonic literature and the things that's influenced. So I'd just be really interested to hear what you might think about where photography brings us into connection with, through its kind of material technological nature, to this more metaphysical quality of light, or this more spiritual quality of light. Because I think that's a really important question about what that technology does, and particularly how it relates to our our daily experiences with light emitting screens and surfaces and such things.
Yes. I think there's your comments. Actually, there were so many different aspects. But first, let me just bring it back slightly to Barth, and then I'll answer your question. I think with Barth, what's interesting is, we were talking about invisibility, the formlessness of Khora, and Barth in Camera Lucida, he mentions the notion that when we see a photograph, we always look at the referent, which is the subject that's photographed, isn't it? We look at the photograph of a loved one, it's the loved one that we see, but we never see the paper itself, the picture, the materiality of the photographic paper. So this notion that photography is always deictic, the photograph, that it always points to something, is, I think he's really onto something there. I think that light is obviously both material, talk about the spiritual element, but one of my chapters in the book, I looked at Philotheus of Battles, and this is actually according to Georges Didi Huberman. Huberman, in a lovely essay called Celui qui inventa le verbe photographier, he who invented the verb to photograph. Huberman points out that, in fact, the verb to photograph was already invented by one of the desert fathers called Philotheus of Battles, who lived in the Sinai desert. And Philotheus used the term photographenestai. Danny, you have to correct my Greek pronunciation. But so Philotheus, he was referring to Christ imprinting himself onto the practitioner's soul. So Philotheus wrote a text called the 40 Texts on Watchfulness, and he practiced nepsis, which is this watchfulness, constant guarding of your mind and your heart, to banish all images, to banish any thoughts. So in order to purify yourself and to receive Christ imprinting himself, photographing himself into your heart. And the word itself, the verb, is reflexive. It's not humans photographing Christ, but in fact, the divine that's imprinting into our heart or our soul. So already this word, already was there before photography was ever invented. I find that really fascinating. And of course, Iamblichus uses the term photogogia, which is the leading on of light, evoking the light. Or I think Gregory Shaw, in his book Hellenic Tantra, he translates it as the induction of light. So photogogia, this notion of capturing light, is the condition for the ascent of the soul, or anagogy, to take place.
No, I mean, one of the through lines that I love about your book, and you as a practitioner of photography and a lover of its history, is this kind of seeing the parallel between Khora, the philosopher, the human soul, light, as what Gareth just said, a medium, right? Or media, right? Right. It is this uncanny space, invisible, malleable, something that, so in the Timaeus, the third kind, Khora, always in itself reflects an indefinite something, a gesture to something, right? But, something that is not yet concrete. So that within her dimly lit space, right, there's a gesture towards somethingness that is also nothingness, much like a contemporary photograph does now. As you said, a photograph now is neither an essential medium getting at the essence of things, nor is it just completely pomo and referring to the nothing that refers to the nothing that refers to the nothing, something completely under erasure. But no, it's a support for the time at the time, or the person. It's both the subject and not the subject, as you, I think, astutely make a parallel between the Phaedo, which is this, K-bays and the image of K-bays are not there. It's an image of K-bays, but it is K-bays, and so this indefinite both and as being part of what it means to be the medium, if you will, of light, where it's both something receptive, but also something that erases. It both is and is not, and that, as you mentioned just a little bit ago, and as Greg Shaw emphasizes, this is part of the process of you have to empty yourself, so to speak, to receive this generosity of the one or the good or the light. That is also a kind of medium, so that you become like the medium, whether it be photography, like when you are doing your work in the dark room, right? You're letting yourself understand the value of both light and dark. You become like the very Khoratic space that is both and that's the life of the philosopher, and so on and so forth. So that this photogogia in Iamblichus, I like to translate it as let the light lead you, right? This leading light, this daemonic light, that you walk the path towards the light, in that kind of mystical, beautiful way. And so, yeah, I'm just rambling now because I'm inspired by your thoughts. So just let me know what you're thinking, and I'm excited. So.
Yes, Shaw mentions Khora doesn't he? The verbal cognate, Khorain, and he talks about how Iamblichus uses the term Khorain to discuss the importance of the theurgist in emptying his soul in order to become a receptacle, ipodoke, which obviously is also in the Timaeus. So the theurgist needs to empty his soul in order to receive, to become a container for divine light. So that's a very kind of like, I think that in many ways the theurgist soul is akin to a photographic emotion in order to prepare himself to receive divine possession. And it's fascinating how in the Mysteris on the mysteries, Iamblichus talks about the 3 stages of anagogy, or the ascent of the soul. I think the first stage is purification of the soul. The second is the participation in the vision of the good. And then the third is divine union. And the theurgist soul then becomes like akin to a photographic emotion to receive the lights of the gods. And it seems that how would I say it, that depending on the ranks of the gods, the higher the ranking of the deities, the stronger, the more intense the light. And then there's like a alternation as well, which is interesting. There's like constant drawing down of light and also fulguration, kind of like flashes of light when divine appears. And of course, you have
that for me.
Sorry. Yes.
Oh, no. I was going to run with the flashes of light, right? Where that's one of the ways that you draw a parallel between photography or contemporary photography and some of these images from the past, right? Where, the epiphany or the all of a sudden, right? You have this idea, this just comes upon you, just like, this kind of flash of light that comes when, you can't allow too much, right? Because then it would be the overexposure. It would be too muchness. And so the beauty of how a photograph or a memory or an idea, they're not just mere ideas or mere copies or mere no, they give us that flash of remembrance of that quick divine light, in the same way that, we need that flash in order for a photograph to be able to refer to the, indefinite something that is the subject. So.
Yes, Walter Benjamin writes in his lovely essay, A Small History of Photography, he talks about the tiny spark of contingency. And I've always loved that. There's always something excess there, isn't it? There's always something excess in the photographic image. And this notion of this flash, something fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think this also brings us into this question of the relation to time as well, doesn't it, in many interesting ways? And I was thinking here of a beautiful little quote from The Cloud of Unknowing. In one small particle of time, little as it is, heaven can be won and lost. And, you know, that I think, in a sense, when we also put this within the context of, yeah, Benjamin, of course, and particularly with his famous essay in the 1930s on technical reproduction and the auratic nature of the presence and place of the work of art, and then technological reproduction and so on. And the kind of arguments and techniques that were being developed by Fernand Léger and other sorts of experimental Richter and people working with experimental film and so on. Interestingly, a lot of these characters were like Viking Egling, and these sort of early experimental filmmakers were very strongly influenced by Bergson and Nietzsche even, and so that sort of turn of the century uh, transformation. There's a very interesting book by Stephen Kern called The Culture of Time and Space, which is sort of about, in a way, it's a sort of a book which you could think about in a relationship to our own time and our own technological revolutions in a way, because it charts the period probably from about the 1880s to the post First World War period, and that the development of particular kinds of technologies, transmission, transport, war, that would, and even Einstein's early theories and so on, Bergson, and how this paradigm shift, as it were, to sort of use Thomas Kuhn's phrase, is implicit within the technology itself. So technology becomes this, or mind, if you like, to some extent, becomes isomorphically related to the technological development. So we start to think of ourselves, as Bergson says, as cinematographic, having cinematographic minds. So there's an interesting sense in which technology sort of we become it in some sense, or like the extension of man, as McLuhan says. And I was thinking about that in relation to our own time, of course, where probably I'd hazard a guess that certainly that more photographs are taken every day than probably has ever been taken, across the days past, and we're probably reaching some crescendo point where more photographs will be taken in a day than in the entire 20th century, or and so on. So we have this sort of abundance, this overabundance, this kind of flood, don't we, of images? And yet each one in its own way is an instant, and each one is its own set of temporalities. And that's one of the interesting things about photographs, isn't it? Is that on the one hand, there's a certain kind of tendency in the technology to kind of create a flatness to some degree, because two single photographs can seem, on the one hand, to have a certain kind of comparability, a certain kind of equivalence, but yet they're vastly different. Each one maybe has a different exposure time. Each one was taken in a different kind of light, a different time, or whatever it might be. And so, and in their own ways, they contain their own memories, their own times, and so on. So I guess the thought for me here is about almost this kind of, well, you could call it almost a kind of ethical dimension of photography, this sense in which there's some way in which we can approach it as a practice that seeks to sort of look into time rather than just capture it, to somehow, bring the meaning out from the temporalities and possibilities within it, rather than it being this sort of constant set of interchangeable instants. And I suppose that brings me back to this idea that heaven can be won and lost in an instant, because how do we, that's maybe the difference, isn't it? Is that you can lose it or you can gain it. but only if you determine some difference between the qualitative difference rather than the quantitative equivalence between them as types of things. And I think that's what you're talking about so beautifully here, which we could call the kind of ontology of the photograph, and like what it sort of is really as a thing, and how profoundly we're wrapped up with it, and how almost little we realize it. So yeah, there's just a few thoughts there, but yeah, have you got any thoughts on that? This idea of the winning and losing of the moment somehow, because I know you've taken many images and you spent many years looking through a lens, as it were. So there's this you've trained yourself to have a certain kind of attention to looking. So yeah, I just wonder what that might mean for you.
I think that photography enables us to discover the world around us in many ways, doesn't it? That's what I try to do when I teach my students in class, to devise exercises where they can actually slow down and to observe things that that would escape their attention, things that are minute, that are inconsequential, can have immense beauty. However, I think that, Gareth, as you've mentioned, this age of inundation of images, then another question is, there's no longer any singularity between two images. If they're reproduced, if they're exactly the same, a digital replica, and then the resolution, the more you copy, the more it kind of disintegrates. Or, in fact, with generative AI images, then what kind of image is that? I think that's a very pertinent question that we are all confronting now, where there's no longer actually that has been, Barth says it so beautifully in Camera Lucida,
Mm.
but that has been, has it gone now?
So you guys are both reminding me of a very important problem when it comes to these technologies of light, right? Which is the hard and disciplined work that goes into creating a medium that will capture light, whether it be, I'm going to argue Plato with writing, right? That he found a way to capture light in writing so that writing could be a living thing rather than a dead thing. So that way people could see that the law isn't dogmatic, but it's moving, much the same way that Khora is always stimulating movement. And each technology ultimately leads to this democratization of that capturing of light, so that now everybody, for the most part, let's hope, can write and read. And the invention of the modern photograph, right? That was for the rich. That was for the crazy experimental guys working with all sorts of chemicals to think if they could capture shadows on certain kinds of paper. And then they figured it out, and then the rich got a hold of it and started taking photographs because they wanted to be able to capture light. And then slowly but surely, the masses, now we have the masses being able to capture things. And I think about the allegory of the cave, right? And that this is part of the overexposure, so to speak, of a certain technology that allows us to have this kind of access to something beautiful, something amazing, something miraculous, something quadratic and epiphanic, right? And when that happens, people stop having the attention, as Gareth, of how this media or medium is doing this really amazing work, right? We start to just see them as shadows and selfies and and so when we think about this new technology, AI, and its democratization, how do you think it is contributing to the need, so to speak, for a new technology that can capture light and remind people of this kind of special quality of the photograph? And I'm using the word photograph broadly construed now as, this kind of writing with light, or writing with inspiration, or speaking with inspiration, or living with inspiration, that kind of divine light that charges the soul to move and change and become otherwise.
I would say AI generated images are extractive because, they don't exist. I don't think there's light. Maybe there's no light in them. I don't know.
No, I find them to be very plastic, right? In this very strange way, right? That they all look kind of the same. Like you can tell immediately. So, I mean, I get a little annoyed when I see, even with Platonic mysticism or other things that we produce, every now and again, we use an AI generated image in order, and it looks like a cartoon, it just screams not real in much the same way that in your book you adeptly refer to book 10 and the problem of mirrors, right? That mirrors, you can walk around all day long and have a mirror in your hand and you can easily reproduce X, Y, or Z, but it isn't real. And if you get lost in the sauce of that, then we need a new philosopher to kind of wake us up to how we're reproducing copies of copies rather than a copy of an original. And so.
Yeah, I mean, this obviously relates closely to Plotinus in a sense, doesn't it? Because he says, Phidias doesn't look at, something out there to make his image. He looks in there, So it's a sort of internal kind of looking. I think this takes us back to something we were talking about earlier about this idea of the imprint or the trace, and you put it very beautifully about this sort of the receptacle idea, Theresa, as well. And something we've talked about before, Danny, a famous essay by Andre Bazin on the ontology of the photographic image. And it's interesting because, one of his arguments is that, art, in a sense, strives to depict the eternal, but photography embalms time. So it's like this transcription of the real, which is a connection to the sort of indexicality argument of photography, which, of course, as you pointed out, Theresa, becomes kind of displaced by the notion of the digital in a way, or the idea that there is no was there of the content of the photograph. To a degree, I guess there's an argument that there was there in a lot of other art as well, I guess, isn't there? I mean, maybe in an abstract painting or something like that. But maybe the was there is somewhere else, except that AI doesn't see that, because the was there in this sense is more of the kind of Platonian inwardness. It's the kind of visionary or imaginative, which is the source or the locus of this kind of vision, even though it's abstract. So it is a sort of transcription of the real, albeit one that doesn't have a kind of verisimilitude to it, in the classical sense in which realists, cinema theorists, and so on imagined, and Bazin imagined film and photography having the kind of verite, the sort of truth, as it were. So yeah, it's an interesting problem because I guess what I'm saying is that realism doesn't necessarily account for real, but at the same time, the derivative nature and, as you put it, kind of extractivist nature, as it were, of the generative image sort of lacks that originary impulse, wherever that comes from, that was there, as you put it very nicely, I thought. And of course, it's they're algorithmically aggregated from scraping, thousands, millions of other images. All of these precious moments, these instants, these things that maybe people have put online, I don't know, and then it sort of puts them into some kind of algorithmic soup from which comes forth the slop of derivative mimicry or something, I don't know, but it's not real in that sense, is it, of having this wasness, as if you want to call it that, I suppose, to sort of make something up. But I don't know. I just think it's always struck me as an interesting problem, because I've even struggled with this myself in terms of working a lot with digital images over the years as well, and thinking about what is their kind of substantial or essential nature as things, and their properties as things, and their ability to degrade or disappear, or be kind of effervescent almost, or nothing all of a sudden. But yet, we have to grapple with holding on to what they maybe are, because so much of our lives are transmitted and mediated through the digital image. So it's not a sort of way back, but it's a way through, isn't it? It's a kind of, how do we understand that? And I think the traditions we're talking about give us some of those tools and some of those sort of philosophical frameworks to say, okay, well, actually, photography existed before photography, and the problem of what a real image is existed a long time before digital images were invented. And the question of whether we're looking at something true or false, or whether we're deceived, or whether we're right, these are philosophical questions as much as they are technological ones.
Absolutely. Well said.
So all of this reminds me of Khora and the dimly lit, as well as the cave and the darkness. And I was just thinking and inspired to think of AI images as a return to origins, right? Or the return to the beginning, in which when Timaeus begins the third, or the narration of the third kind, that we have to utilize a form of bastard reasoning to figure all this out. Like, we live in an age of dimly lit images, and now we're going to have to get creative, right? We're going to have to humble ourselves and say, I don't really know what's going on, but I'm still lit up by light. I still have that ability to follow those dimly lit things and to see the small trace, the seed of light in that selfie of Kim Kardashian, even, right? That I, as an artist, right, can see the mundane has some sort of beauty. And I think about some of my students who, when they make their creative projects and they go to their phone and they just clip together all these random photos and make a little movie, and then suddenly it's inspiring, right? So that here, maybe we're back at the beginning again, right? In a world that is dimly lit, all these images that just, we know there's a trace of something in them, but that trace is inviting the demiurgic in ourselves to take these dimly lit things and to give them form and structure, material, right? To give the matter, get them back into their fire, water, earth, air, and then, the dodecahedron, the mathematics of it. And so maybe we're living in an age of an invitation, where we have to take things like AI stuff. As you said, we can't, become Luddites and dismiss these new technologies, but we have to go through them. We have to bring them with us. And so, what kind of art and what kind of tech will save even the grossness of the deceptive, false? Because this is a problem in your book too. You aptly make the parallel between the sophist and the philosopher, that the sophist is the one basically in the cave of, dimly lit, deceitful shadows, but shadows themselves are actually necessary for authenticity and truth and justice. So we need to be able to recognize in the fakeness of AI picture making something still beautiful nonetheless. And so
I think the key here is the realization, isn't it? Not to be deceived like the prisoners by these shadows, but to actually know how to see, to think. And that's the task of the philosopher, to help us.
Yeah. Do you think that people want to be deceived in this age?
Yes, I think so, because being deceived is an easy way to coast along and not to do the hard work of thinking or to face a blank sheet of paper to write, because it's easier just to quickly send a prompt to one of the co-pilots or Gemini or any of the LLMs and get them to do the work for you.
Yeah, and I think this is why you open and come back all the time to the difficulty of all of this, right? And this is something that I have been fascinated with in Plato for a long time. The Kalipon, the every time Socrates starts a new, story or adventure or discussion, like emphasizing how difficult these things are, and it's difficult to do the work of trying to save the appearances. It's hard, and so much of contemporary and modern life is geared towards let's make everything easy, whether that be education or health, love. Yeah, it. Maybe this is just my weird character, but I've never understood the desire for the easy path. Yeah, Gareth, you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess this is some armchair psychology, I suppose, in some senses, but it's, all of us in some ways can be good deceivers of our own natures, can't we? In terms of, sometimes it's the easier thing to do. It's the sort of the gate is wide that leads to destruction, and the gate is narrow that leads to salvation, isn't it? Idea really from the Gospels that, sometimes it's hard to make the right choice or hard to face up to your own but it's also a kind of in itself a mirror of our awareness of our own failures and limitedness in that sense as well, isn't it? And our capacity to sort of transcend that. That I think is just what it means to be human, but it's also something to a degree that can be exacerbated by our relationship with certain kinds of technologies or, excuses to divert our attention to other things and so on and so forth. So I'm not altogether convinced by the technologically deterministic argument that it's just phones or it's just social media or it's just AI that are the determining causes of all of these things. I think it's as much human nature as well, but certainly in some weird act of even greater self-delusion, we could tell ourselves that it's the fault of all of these things as well, couldn't we? Well, and then if you like, divert the agency of our decision to some other thing, which it's its fault that I don't get any of my work done because I'm looking on my phone or whatever, So, but that's not to say that they're not challenges and problems we have to try and sort of work through as anyone else that's probably been distracted across all the millennia of mankind has had to face up to different kinds of distractions as well, I'm sure. So again, I think it comes back to a general sense of receptivity. We've talked about this many, many times, haven't we? And couldn't put it better than you did earlier, Theresa, really, this idea of emptying to become a receptacle. And if we choose to fill ourselves with all of these other sorts of distractions and so on, which can be many, then it's easy to say that it's the tech and it's the technology or the media or whatever that's doing it. But I'm sure if many of us just looked at ourselves a bit harder in the mirror, we'd see that we at least could begin some agency in how we navigate and work with these things, which to me suggests positive ways that we can use this stuff, and I've embraced using digital processes and images in my work for many years, for that reason, I think. I mean, it's a bit like just one sorry, very quick thought was Tolkien. He says about this idea that in a way, because we have a kind of divine character and we seek things through myth and images, that some aspect of splintered light reaches us as the truth. So there's this lovely idea that even if things are kind of fuzzy and obscured and not quite clear, a splinter of light you know, just holds the truth.
So maybe, Theresa, that to get to one of the questions of your book, of what is the idea of photography, right? Maybe one of the problems with the contemporary world is how easy it is to take a photograph. Now that you can take a photograph of everything now. You can, if you really wanted to, you could set up cameras in your house all the time and be filming yourself all of the time. Like it's completely accessible, and maybe that's why we have a problem, is because we're not relating to this medium anymore with that kind of thoughtfulness, with that kind of understanding what this medium does to us and what we do to it. What could you speak to me about, like, or us about, like, do you think, because this is one of the criticisms that photography is not an art, if you will, because it's so easy. You just click, and then you've got your image, and there's no art to it anymore. And so, yeah. What do you say to that? Do you think photography is an art, in the way that you would argue that is difficult and demanding and needed, so to speak, so that we can once again capture light in a profound way?
Well, I think this idea whether or not photography is an art, that debate started already when photography was invented. Wasn't it Baudelaire who criticized photography as not being art? But I think that the proliferation of the smartphone and the smartphone camera, in many ways, it's not a bad thing, isn't it? Because when you think about how people send a photograph to their friends, that's the way of actually showing that they've been there. So it's kind of replacing words as well. So I think that it's not a matter, I guess, whether or not to call photography an art, it depends on your intention of using, how you use the camera, what you want to do with it. If you just want to use it as a way to document, let's say, I don't know, instead of photocopying something, you document a page, you go to the library, you don't need to scan anymore, you just use your mobile phone to take a picture of that page. I mean, it's very useful. It's a useful tool as such. But I wouldn't call that page, that document of the photograph of that page, as an art. But I think that it depends. It's more so that's why photography is halepon as well, because it's difficult. It's got no so-called identity of its own, often seen that way, because it's got so many uses and it's very, very useful as a technology. Can you imagine a world without photographs? How can we remember our ancestors, or how can we document ourselves, or your parents document you as a child? I don't know, all of even our memories, isn't it? Often it's replaced by pictures somehow. I find sometimes looking at a photograph of a loved one in the past, it's almost like that photograph replaces the memory of it in many ways. And it kind of makes everything fuzzy as well.
No, I mean, this is, I think, every art. You made me think of dance, right? You made me think of painting. You made me think of, like, again, like that all of these media for capturing the light we see in the subject, whether that subject be internal or external, that the difficulty is seeing the ambiguity and the need for that ambiguity, that fuzziness, if you will, that reminds us that somebody was moving, and so it was hard to capture that dancer leaping, so on and so forth. And so, no, yeah, this is one of the most fascinating parts of being a Platonist, is recognizing this value in the negative, this value in the indefinite, this value in space that is no space, but sets the conditions to create spaces for others, for difference and change. And so, yeah. Yeah, so you end your book with Ficino. Could you explain to our audience why?
Gosh, it's been a long time since I read Ficino. I don't remember that
Oh,
much.
no, no, no.
The
Yeah, sorry.
least part of the
It was just a beauty.
podcast.
So,
Don't ask me. Ficino. I suppose I'm very interested in Ficino because of his beautiful essays on light.
yeah,
You
that's
know,
right.
his beautiful writings on light, as well as his solar regime, because there's so much about the sun in my book. You know, as Derrida says, his beautiful essay, Demeure Athènes, Athens still remains, that all photography is of the sun. Toute photographie est du soleil. So I ended my book with Ficino because of his wonderful work, The Three Books on Life, where he encourages us to adopt the solar regime, the philosopher, to eat foods and everything that's more kind of solar related. I guess we should ask your previous podcast guest, Anna Soria, to explain more.
Well, no, but that's exactly what I was hoping to hear, right? Is that this, I'm always coming back to the Renaissance as a site for hope for our contemporary age, right? And just to think of this solar regime, just to think of this bursting light that comes from the underworld that's gone dark, right? But then, boom, we get this like traces suddenly in the morning and it rises. But we also know it's going to, return to its abode in the underworld into the dark space. And just like I argue about Khora, like reason why we have so many beginnings in the Timaeus is because I tend to imagine, the demiurge coming across Khora and all the dimly lit things within her, because of course he doesn't come up to something that's empty. Khora's filled with dimly lit, moving things that are not a concrete something, right? And that's every morning, so to speak, that we all wake up and we've got another project we've got to create, and so that the beginning of the Timaeus, or the beginning of the third kind of the Timaeus, reminds us that we have to do this work of taking the dimly lit every day, and so that the cosmos is going to become concrete, and it's going to have a world, and then she's going to be overexposed, and then boom, now we have to be demiurges again with demiurgic activities and put it all back together. Yes, I'm thinking of Humpty Dumpty now. It is our task to be the ones that recreate worlds each day again and again, because that's what it is to live in this kind of solar kingdom, is this ever-moving, ever-recreative force that is the choratic receptacle. And so.
And of course, the third kind, the triton genos, is also light, isn't it? That's what Socrates says in the Republic, that there is another third kind, he says, that brings about seeing, isn't it? Brings about the conditions of visibility, or else without this third kind, we won't be able to see color, we won't be able to see anything. So the third kind is light.
Yep, exactly, and that's why I think she's described as dimly lit, right? It is the epiphanic, or the epiphany, that is very, very small, but you can't just have an epiphany. You have to do something with it, right? It'll remain dim, it'll remain indefinite unless you work, as the demiurge does, to, as Gareth quoted in the beginning, let there be light, so that the light can itself be seen, even though it's not being seen. It's lighting up other things, but still bearing that trace of itself.
And of course, God said after that the light was good. So.
And the demiurge he creates because he was not jealous, but good. He wanted truth, justice, value, the eternal in time. Gareth, you tend to have something beautiful to end on, so I'm relying on you for some
Okay,
sort of
yeah. So
miraculous.
I'll bring us back to our sort of theurgic early Christian Neoplatonic kind of phase, and I'll read something that's about the brilliant darkness. So this is Pseudo Dionysius, and this is from a letter that he wrote. The divine darkness is the unapproachable light where God is said to live. And if it is invisible because of a superabundant clarity, it cannot be approached because of the outpouring of its transcendent gift of light. Yet it is here that is found everyone worthy to know God and to look upon him. And such a one, precisely because he neither sees him nor knows him, truly arrives at that which is beyond all seeing and knowledge.
Yeah. Theresa, do you have any final thoughts?
That's beautiful.
Well, Theresa, thank you for being with us here today. I can't wait. So again, for viewers, The History of Light, The Idea of Photography is an amazing book, very inspiring, full of light. She's a essential team member for Palinode Productions, producing all sorts of great artwork to help inspire the making of our Khora. And so, please, reach out to her, get to know her. And once again, thank you, Theresa.
Thank you, Danny and Gareth. I really enjoyed our discussion.
Oh, dear.